What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
Guys, today we are talking top of the heap at 155, specifically Islam Makhachev versus Ilia Topuria. Is this fight going to happen, or does Islam have his sights set on 170, and what's going on with the rest of the top of that division? And today's episode is brought to us by Fight Signal, but more on them later. So, Nick, let's jump into what's sort of going on at 155. You know, when Ilia Topuria vacated the 145 title, that kind of came as a surprise to all of us. He had talked about the difficulties of making weight and stuff like that, but we didn't think it was going to be such an immediate change of division.
Right.
So by default, when you have a champion that's as good as Ilia is, and he's had Islam's name in his mouth for a little while, and he moves up to Islam's division, he becomes a de facto sort of number one contender, or at least one of the number one contenders.
Right.
But the issue is that Islam had a bout scheduled with Arman Tsarukyan that got canceled. So where does that place Arman? And now we also have some other people, Charles Oliveira and things like that are, you know, pining for their shot at the title as well.
Right. Justin Gaethje just got to win.
Yeah, Gaethje got to win. And then we got to also see what's going to sort out in 2 weeks with Paddy Pimblett and Michael Chandler.
Right.
You know, Paddy's a guy that the UFC has proven that they like to fast track. So if he gets the jump, especially if he gets a finish or submission, something like that, he could be in the mix. So what are your thoughts on the current landscape? And then let's talk a little about 170 and what Islam might have his sights on there.
Yeah, well, I think it's really exciting. And 155 has always been just such a stacked division. But I'll say that 170 right now is humming on all cylinders. And 145 was looking really good, but ever since Ilia left, it is sort of missing that key guy. But 155 to me is so interesting because of Ilia moving up and then all of this stuff happening right there at the top of the division. We don't know if Islam's going to hang out and want to defend that title anymore. Something tells me he probably is going to want to, and I think the UFC wants to get Ilia versus Islam in there for the lightweight title before we see Islam eventually move up to 170, which I think he will. But again, this is one of those situations where the UFC hasn't really shown us what direction they're going to go. Ilia has come out and told us time and time again that, you know, expect the unexpected. What I'm going to tell you, what I'm going to announce is going to shock you. Not only who I'm fighting next, but I'm changing my fight name and all this sort of stuff. And we've sort of grown accustomed to hearing Ilia talk, but then just chalking it up to talk. Because he's sort of been calling shots even before he was the champion and saying what he wanted to do. But a lot of people are like, yeah, dude, you're not Conor, so just relax. But he's at this point now where he's gaining a lot of momentum. He's a major star. He has power now because he's a former champion. And I think those little things are what's going to make the big difference. They do make him the number one contender, in my opinion, for Islam, just because he's a new face. He looks like a world beater. He's, nobody in the division has beaten him yet. So I think that is a really good opportunity for Islam to fight somebody, even though he's coming up from 45, a legitimate contender. And I will say this, Ilia Topuria moving up is almost exactly what Islam needs for the 155 division. Because if Islam retires the 155 division and moves up to 170, then it's fine. But nobody will remember his 155 reign quite like he wants them to. A couple of 145ers come up, and then a couple of other people that he's maybe already beaten before in the past. It's just not quite the same. But I think Ilia, with all the hype coming up behind him, and the fact that he's proven that he's got the skills to back it up, and he's not just talking anymore. He said he wanted to move up to 55. He vacated a belt. That's the most valuable thing in the entire sport. He gave it away.
Yeah, so almost nobody does that.
Exactly.
And you know, he had pay-per-view points for as long as he was going to be the champion at 145, and he effectively gave those up. So he's got a lot of confidence. But here's the pushback to, you know, we're talking about Islam's legacy. Right. Islam's legacy is riddled with fighting 145ers.
Right.
You know, Charles Oliveira, even though he saw the best success of his career at 55, he started at 145.
Right.
We had the two fights with Volkanovski, one of which was, you know, extremely competitive.
Right.
And the second was on very short notice. So Islam, I think, in a lot of ways is looking for that true 155 contender. And Islam has come out and said Ilia needs to win a fight at 155 before, I'm ready to face him in this division. Ilia right now is a 145er that's moving up.
Right.
With a win over an Arman Tsarukyan, with a win over a Charles Oliveira, he's really no longer a 145er.
Right.
He's gotten a marquee win against a top 5 guy in the division. Where he was in the past is really irrelevant because now he's cemented himself with a win as a top competitor in the division. So I understand what Islam is saying. In the same token, Ilia is kind of saying, look, I've got the body of work to where I can just come right into a title shot.
Right.
And I know I can beat Islam, and so I want to fight him. So that's going to be the rub. We're going to see who wins out in that negotiation and who wins out in this whole landscape of things.
Well, I will bring this up because Islam Makhachev is a dominant champion, of course, and a lot of people say that if he moves up to 170, let's just assume Bilal loses to JDM, that's a perfect fight for Islam to move up for. Does Islam think that JDM should be able to say, you need to fight somebody at 170 before you get to me? Because that's sort of what he's saying Ilia needs to do, and I don't know exactly what he would say because on merit, I think Ilia deserves a title shot immediately from being a champion. I also think that Islam should move right into a title shot if JDM wins and Bilal loses, because that's just the way this sport seems to work for me.
Well, that's a good way to take Islam's thought process and turn it right back around on him.
Right.
Because he's not going to jump up to 70 and try to become a contender and fight a Sean Brady or fight a Shavkat or something like that. He's going to be looking to go right into a title fight.
Right.
The interesting thing here is, the landscape of 55.
Yeah.
You have Arman Tsarukyan, who is supposed to fight for a title.
Right.
He backed out of the fight. The UFC does not look like they're in a mood to do any sort of favors for Arman Tsarukyan.
No.
I mean, when you pull out of a title fight that close to it happening, and they've spent the marketing dollars and such on making that happen, and then, Renato Moicano is a fan favorite,
right,
but nobody really expected or wanted or was demanding for Moicano versus Makhachev,
right,
but that's what we got.
We knew how that one was going to end.
Yeah, and I'm as big of a Moicano fan as
right,
anybody,
right,
but we all kind of... we're not hoping for that to be the next title shot.
Right.
So it really breaks down into a few questions. Question one, what does the UFC do with Arman Tsarukyan?
Right.
Do they try to make him a matchup against Ilia for the number one contender? Because that's a hard fight for both guys. Stylistically, that is a hell of a welcome to the 155 division for Ilia Topuria. And for Arman Tsarukyan, who is a good striker, but, he's really more of a grappler, going up against somebody who can defend a takedown well and has got extreme knockout power,
right,
is a very difficult... That's almost like saying, you mess with us once, we're going to give you this guy that's got a really good stylistic chance of beating you.
Right.
So question number one that has to parcel out is what happens with Arman Tsarukyan. Question number two is, do they make the Oliveira versus Ilia fight? And if they do, what happens in that fight, right, and how quickly can the turnaround be? We know that Islam Makhachev likes to typically fight once before Ramadan, which we saw earlier in this year.
Right.
And then he likes to fight on that Abu Dhabi card that's in the fall,
right,
usually in October.
Right.
Those are when we see Islam Makhachev fight. So let's just say we're looking at his schedule, how it has been the last couple of years. He's probably going to defend his belt next in the fall, which
right,
is a little bit less active than we would like to see Islam be. However, some things do need to shape out at 155. So if they make Ilia versus Charles, let's say for International Fight Week or something in June or May, that would set up for the winner, provided that it wasn't an all-out, drag-down, knock-em-down war, but
right,
which it could be with Charles. I mean, we have to be quite honest. Like, Charles Oliveira is no walk in the park, and there's also no guarantee that Ilia wins that fight.
Right.
But I think Ilia would probably be the favorite, and I think for good reason. I think that leaning towards Ilia would be a smart money move. Like, I think Ilia would probably win that fight, but how much damage is taken, how much recovery time is given, and would it set Ilia up perfectly for that title shot, presumably in Abu Dhabi? The other question that we have to consider is Paddy Pimblett, Michael Chandler.
Yes.
The UFC likes to fast track people, and Paddy Pimblett is one of the ones who they really have their eye on as a star in the division and,
right,
and a future star of the sport. And he's got a lot of fans behind him. He's got a lot of fame. If he gets in there and is able to beat Michael Chandler, especially if he's able to submit Michael Chandler, where does that put him in
Yeah.
the mix? Do they maybe throw Ilia in there with Paddy for a quick turnaround if we get a quick submission or something like that? Because there is heat there.
Right.
There was a lot of talk not that long ago between Paddy and Ilia,
Right.
and that fight was supposed to happen. So
when they were contenders in two different divisions. One was a 45er making his way up, and one was a 55er making his way up.
exactly. So what's going to shake out there? What are your who would you say, if it's not Ilia, is going to likely be the number one fight for Islam? Because I don't think it's really clear right now. And guys, before we finish up this conversation, we just want to thank today's sponsor, Fight Signal. Fight Signal is the tool that the real diehard fight fans are using to break down UFC fights from an analytical perspective. Fight Signal pulls over 7,500 past UFC fights, compares the stylistic differences between the fighters and how the matchup may play out, and it even pulls what the sentiment on social media is, everything from Reddit, X, YouTube, and beyond. The pro version is $19 a month, but if you use our special code Barnhill, you get 50% off for life.
Oh, yeah.
Fight Signal has been over 80% correct on their predictions of all fights in 2025. Sign up at fightsignal.com. You'll wonder how you ever watched fights without it.
Thank you, Fight Signal. Now let's get back to the show. It's not clear, and that's why I really think this is sort of a waiting game. And I think the UFC is waiting it out. Islam is waiting it out to see what happens at 170. And then the contenders are all just going to have to perform to the best of their abilities and hope that they did enough to get the title opportunity. I don't know exactly what Islam's going to do because October is a very long ways away. And I know we've got the 170 belt getting contested pretty soon. So you just don't know if the scheduling winds up perfect for Islam to be ready to fight again in October, but not at 155. Maybe he sees Ilia fight Charles Oliveira and isn't that impressed with it and realizes, yeah, this is another 45er. He beat Charles, but this is not going to do anything for my legacy. I'd rather just focus on, the winner of, Bilal versus JDM. Hope to God it's JDM, because if Bilal wins, Islam and him are not going to fight each other. I think they've pretty much made that clear.
Yeah.
And that would force Islam to defend against Ilia likely. But I do think that there's a good chance JDM can get his hand raised against Bilal. Tough fight, but I think he could do it. If he does it, I really do think Islam Makhachev looks to go up. I don't think Islam wants to stick around for another 5, 6, 7 years just defending titles at 55. I think he wants to dare to be great and try to move up and prove himself and put himself in the Hall of Fame and in the record books as one of the most dominant champions ever. And unfortunately, even though he's in a stacked division and he's beating great fighters, it's just not the legacy that he wishes he was building because they're 45ers and they're people that he's already beat before. So I think that's a very interesting thing for Islam, and he has the opposite mindset of a lot of people and a lot of champions. He truly wants to fight the best in the world, and I don't think that he is willing to take easy fights over harder fights that help his legacy more. If he goes out there and sees Ilia have a hard time with Charles Oliveira and he notices maybe the size is the reason he can't finish Charles or has a hard time implementing his game plan on Charles, he might go, look, I can beat this guy. And yeah, Ilia's a tough fight, but if I go beat him, people are going to go, yeah, he was a 45er. He was undersized. It doesn't matter. So I don't know if the incentive is there for Islam to want to stick around and wait, which is why I am thinking he's watching that 70 division closely. And I think he wants his friend Bilal to win, but I think he'd be pretty happy with JDM getting his hand raised because that opens up a great fight. Stylistically, probably the best fight at 170 for him to go up there and try to steal the belt. And when you have that happen, then you have to look at 55 because Dana White has come out and said, we're not doing this whole champ thing anymore. We're not locking up two divisions.
Thank God for that, by the way.
Thank God for it.
It was fun when it lasted, but it just, all it does is screw two divisions up for 18 months. It holds two divisions up for a year and a half.
Yeah, for one person to make a really good business decision, which it is, right? If you're a champion and you go move up, you're still getting paid as a champion. I think there's something there, and there's a buffer where if you lose that fight, your next fight, you're still getting pay-per-view money. So people see that as like, okay, I might lose if I move up a division, but at least I can come back down and still get a championship pay-per-view. And if I win the fight where I move up, now I'm the champ in two divisions, I'm making even more money. So I think that the UFC is smart for not letting people do that anymore. I think we just need to move on with divisions, and I think that Islam is going to look to move up. But if he does move up and leaves the 155 division, I don't think he ever comes back, which means they'll vacate his title. And I think if Ilia Topuria gets his hand raised against whoever they give him first, he will get one of those 2 slots in the interim title. And if Paddy the Baddy beats Michael Chandler, a guy who, if Conor McGregor would have gotten his hand raised over Michael Chandler, if they would have ever fought, would have found himself in a title fight, Paddy the Baddy now gets the same chance to fight the same guy. Paddy the Baddy is also a superstar, and he has bad blood and heat and drama with Ilia Topuria, who would likely be the other guy in this interim title fight. I think that's the fight to make. I think the UFC would love to see Ilia and Paddy. I mean, how unlikely would that be? You've got Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, Benny Dariush,
Arman Tsarukyan.
Exactly.
Charles, everybody. Yeah.
The most stacked division. And then the 2 of the names that you probably would have never expected. Ilia Topuria is going to be fighting for the vacant title, and Paddy the Baddy. Most people thought he wouldn't even touch the rankings, but the dude keeps getting his hand raised every time he goes out there. And even before he was a top contender, and even before Ilia was the champion, he was calling for that fight. He wanted to fight him. I don't know if that's because he saw the potential in Ilia and he knows that would be a big fight later on, or if he actually sees holes in Ilia's game. I'm willing to bet that Paddy the Baddy thinks he can beat Ilia Topuria.
Oh, yeah.
And I think if we have a vacant title at 155, that those 2 boys are going to be fighting for it.
Yeah, it would be very interesting. Here is how you get Paddy Pimblett versus Ilia Topuria for the undisputed 155 title. Yeah. So it starts with Islam moving to 170.
Right.
So that's the first thing we have to parcel out. Is the UFC going to allow for that? And I would say absolutely yes, if it weren't for the fact that 170 is just popping right now.
Crazy.
I mean, Sean Brady just put on the performance of a lifetime against Leon Edwards. Shavkat Rakhmonov is in the mix. Mm-hmm. And then obviously JDM and Bilal are going to shake things out. But you've got a whole slew, the Carlos Pratezes of the world.
Gary.
Yeah, those folks are on their way up. And
Joaquin Buckley.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, we could go on and on about what 170 looks like. And so does the UFC have an appetite to let Islam go in there and shake that up? And then if that happens, let's say they do allow for it. Let's say JDM does win this fight and they allow Islam to go challenge for champ status. That would effectively, if we're taking the UFC at their word, would open a vacancy because they're not allowing champ anymore. So it would open a vacancy at 155,
right,
which then you effectively have a 4-man tournament for the next champion.
Right.
And that would be Charles versus Ilia, presumably.
Great fight.
That is not solidified. However, Pimblett versus Michael Chandler is solidified. That would be the other half of the 4-man tournament. And if Paddy beats Michael Chandler, which I don't think is a stretch of the imagination to say could happen, and Ilia is to beat Charles Oliveira, which I think we can both agree certainly could happen, that is how you get Ilia Topuria versus Paddy Pimblett for the 155 belt, whether it's interim or if the UFC makes good on their promise that champ season is over for the vacant.
Yeah, and it's not even that hard. I mean, it's just a couple of fights. And I'm not going to give my predictions away, but if they make Ilia versus Charles, Ilia is likely going to be the favorite.
Yeah.
You know, Charles is a king of the division. He is in the Hall of Fame, or he's going to be in the Hall of Fame.
One of the best
He's
ever.
in the history books. The dude is just a legend of the sport, but he's lost a lot. Ilia he's not tasted defeat like that. So there are ways Ilia can win that fight. And then Michael Chandler, of course, he's a dog. He's been a top contender. And even though he doesn't get his hand raised all that much, he's still carrying some steam in that division. But he does give his back up a little bit, and I'm excited to break that fight down because Paddy the Baddy has been showing some great striking skills, but he got into the UFC off of good grappling skills, and I think he's going to look to try to exploit Michael Chandler in that situation, especially now knowing that he's got heat with Ilia. Ilia's likely going to find himself in a title fight at 55 within the next 12 months, and if Paddy the Baddy gets one more win, he's going to be the guy that fights Ilia. So I think that this 55 is about to be flipped upside down.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be a total changing of the guards. It's really weird when you see, these guys that have been staples in the 2, 3, 4 rankings in these divisions. And then even with a win or even with another number one contenders fight, they might not get the title fight. It's just a crazy time for this sport, crazy time for the division. But Islam Makhachev really still holds all the power and control. And I think he is just going to wait and see what happens at 70 and wait and see what happens at 55. Because at this point, I think Islam is more prioritizing his legacy rather than just accumulating title fights for the hell of it. I think he wants people to respect his title run, his reign as a champion. And unfortunately for him, even though he's fighting the best dudes in the world, like Volkanovski, pound for pound, he was number 1 when they fought.
Yeah.
Ilia Topuria is top 3 pound for pound. So he's fighting the hardest people in the world, but they're not in his division, so he's not getting the same love. That is going to be frustrating for Islam, and that's the reason I think he's going to be hoping that his friend Bilal wins, but going to be more than okay if JDM gets his hand raised, because stylistically that is a perfect match for Islam.
Yeah, talking about Islam's move up to 170, I say it's about 50-50 whether the UFC allows it.
Yeah.
And right now, I mean, they're going to allow it at some point, but I think it's going to completely depend on how far out Shavkat Rakhmonov is from returning.
Right. Shavkat's the big...
He's the X factor. And I don't believe Islam would fight Bilal, but I do believe Islam would fight Shavkat.
Oh, yeah.
And I think there would be a massive appetite for that fight.
Can you imagine that fight?
Yeah, it would be.
Breaking it down?
I would love to do that, and I hope we get the chance to one day. But if JDM wins... and there can be a quick turnaround, and Islam can pop in there, not on his normal spot in Abu Dhabi in October, but let's say sometime during the summer. I think the UFC may make that fight if Shavkat needs another 6-7 months.
Right.
Because if Islam can get in there and beat JDM, then you could potentially, and I know I almost shudder to say we could see Islam fight 3 times in a year, because that's very unlikely to happen. But you could potentially see a return of Rakhmonov in Abu Dhabi versus Islam Makhachev. Now, a lot has to happen. And and JDM is no walk in the park. That is not a guarantee that JDM is even going to beat Bilal. But if he does, there's no guarantee that Islam would be able to beat JDM, especially if he can beat Bilal.
Yeah.
Because that shows you just how good Jack Della Maddalena is. So there's a lot of moving parts. But I am so excited because the 2 divisions right now that I think have the most excitement are 155 again with the surge of newcomers.
Right.
And then 170 also with the surge of newcomers, but just a stacked top of the heap as well. And those 2 divisions are right next to each other. So the cross-pollination of your Islams going up and stuff like that is a real possibility. And I can't wait to see what shakes out.
I can't either. And I'm just going to be this guy 1 second and say, don't you wish we had that 165 division right about now? I feel like if we moved welterweight to 75 and had 65, we could have some really interesting matchups. And maybe some of these guys like Oliveira and Gaethje, the ones whose days as 55 champion are maybe over, they could be moving up to 65. But obviously that's for another day, another conversation. But I think the way the UFC and all the tools that they have to play right now between 55 and 70, they are going to make the best decisions and the right decisions off the fights that happen and the results that they get. I just have a feeling some of the speculation that we're on to is what we're going to see happen in real life.
I think so.